Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is February 14th, 2024, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So let's start with the big, great news today, and that is yet another Russian ship destroyed by the Ukrainian drones. And this time it's another Russian landing ship named Cesar Kunikov, which was hit in the Black Sea this morning by various Ukrainian sea babies, so these unmanned sea vessels. And it has been confirmed that it has sunk. So, as I mentioned last week, you guys remember perhaps I made a video about the Boyko Tower mission. So Ukrainian Special Forces conduct a mission in the middle of the Black Sea between Odessa and Crimea, where there's a complex of oil drilling platforms. They're called the Boyko Towers. And this is where the Ukrainians destroyed Russian radar systems, which allowed the Russians to have visibility over what was happening in the Black Sea. So certainly I think that mission that the Ukrainians conducted last week allowed the Ukrainians to conduct this successful operation in destroying the Cesar Kunikov landing ship today. And this leaves the Russian Black Sea Fleet with only 5 serviceable ships, down from 13 at the start of the conflict. And it's a huge embarrassment again for the Kremlin. You guys can see that this is a pretty significant ship in terms of its symbolism and what it's capable of doing. It is manned by 87 crew members and is capable of carrying about 650 tons of cargo. So it can carry, there's various loading options here, either 150 troops and 10 T-55 tanks, or different amphibious swimming tanks, or just transporting ammunition and shells. So this ship certainly is a huge loss for the Russians, which certainly we're utilizing this landing ship to transport cargo and perhaps even tanks. And it can also cover a distance of about 4,700 miles. So this is a great hit by the Ukrainians. And last thing I want to mention before I move on is that this event is full of interesting coincidences, because the Cesar Lvovich, so the ship, which is named after Cesar Lvovich Kunikov, so he was a Soviet officer, he actually died on February 14th, so on the same date, in 1943, and he was buried in Gelendzhik, where Putin has one of his bunkers, allegedly. So an interesting event full of coincidences. However, I need to highlight, of course, that this embarrassment for the Russians won't change the current situation that is happening on the battlefield in Donbass, so the land warfare situation. And this leaves me to the next big topic, and that's Avdiivka. As you guys know already, I've talked about it last week in my last video about the situation being critical, and most likely the Ukrainians will have to retreat in the next few weeks from Avdiivka. And what happened in the last few days is that essentially under the command of Syrsky, the 110th Brigade was rotated out. So they pulled them out of Avdiivka because they've been fighting there for many years now. And the 3rd Assault Brigade came in to replace them. So fresher troops who are meant to be more on with a mentality of assaults. As you can see, basically they're going to change their tactics from more of a passive defense in Avdiivka to a very active defense, more aggressive, more flexible, mobile forces are going to be in Avdiivka, trying to make it as costly as possible for the Russians. They're trying to do everything possible to capture Avdiivka. So I think the strategy now for the Ukrainians are to make it as costly as possible for the Russians, and perhaps hold Avdiivka as long as possible until the Russian elections in March 2024, giving a big blow for Putin's attempts to make it look like a massive victory, and then bolstering his support in March. So perhaps the Ukrainians will be able to hold parts of the city long enough to not allow Putin to have this victory that he ordered since October of last year. So, as you guys can see, let's do just a quick update of what happened in Avdiivka. But you guys can see that the Russians made further gains kind of in the center of the city of Avdiivka. They've cut the city kind of in half. So one of the main logistic routes that the Ukrainians are using has been cut off. Now, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians don't have any alternative roads, but they're more dangerous and less reliable, going through farm fields and things like that. So the Ukrainians still have ways to resupply their forces right now in the city center of Avdiivka, but it's very critical. And you can see that the Russians are making gains, consolidating, pushing through. No matter what the cost is, they will continue on. So right now, with the 3rd Assault Brigade being present here, I think that there are talks of them trying to repel these Russian gains. So we'll see what happens next week. But for sure, this next week is going to be critical because we'll see either Russians continuing and consolidating their gains in Avdiivka, or perhaps pushed back a little bit to give some breathing room for the Ukrainian troops. But it doesn't look good, and I think that certainly if this trend continues, then the next few weeks the Ukrainians will have no choice but to retreat to better defensive positions. So unfortunately, that's the situation right now, but it's good to see that there's been a rotation with more experienced, fresher troops. Thus why the 3rd Assault Brigade has been given the task to defend Avdiivka. And last thing I want to talk about, and let's go back to the slides, and that is the Kremlin denying that they were trying to essentially have ceasefire talks with the United States, and that is obviously ceasefire in Ukraine. So basically, there were rumors in the last few days that essentially in 2023, lots of Russian leaders appointed by Putin went and tried to suggest to the United States that they were open to talks, they were open to a ceasefire in Ukraine, but the United States essentially denied that because they wanted Ukraine to be part of these talks. They didn't want to, sidestep Ukraine and essentially force a deal onto Ukraine without them being part of these talks. So apparently these talks failed, but certainly if the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, denies it, that it's not true, as you can see here, it certainly happened. And it just shows you guys that Russia is certainly in a dire situation, that even a few months ago, Russia was already trying to force some sort of ceasefire, some negotiations, because clearly Russia is in a very bad economic, military, and social situation right now. There's no doubt about it. And, gross estimates, even though they're in a bad situation, gross estimates give Russia about 2 to 3 years of combat capacity, being able to continue with their offensive operations in Ukraine before they get absolutely exhausted or incapable anymore of following orders. So that's still a long time, but that's why this year, 2024, is absolutely critical for Ukraine. It needs to have 100% of the United States support and also its partners. Unfortunately, we see that right now that's being hijacked by the GOP. It's being sabotaged, and it's very unfortunate because Ukraine is so close, but yet again so far, right? We know that Ukraine victory isn't going to happen this year, perhaps not even next year, but Ukraine is very close. And, Russia has no choice but to continue with this fallacy, this sunk cost fallacy, right? And this is why it's so important that the United States approves this bill that will offer Ukraine $60 billion of military assistance, which will be essentially this lifeline, which will allow Ukraine to not only defend itself, but then eventually cripple Russia. And I really believe in that. And so let me know what you guys think about this situation. But certainly, Putin will try to utilize these unofficial channels, utilizing his minions, and try to hint and suggest rather than claiming it himself, because he doesn't want to make himself look bad if these talks fail, right? So he can say, oh, well, that never happened. These are just BS channels and BS rumors. We never suggested that. So, but it certainly shows and indicates that the Kremlin is in a very dire situation right now. Thank you for your support, guys. Again, a huge thank you. Subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content. Leave me a like, leave me a comment about any of the topics I covered today. And I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!